What's on your radar, Briahna?
Well, Robbie, Americans know they have some of the worst health care in the Western world. We pay twice as much for worse care, and while other countries guarantee that you can get medical treatment if you're sick, no matter how much you earn for a living or how rich your parents were, in America, whether you can get treatment depends on whether you can afford exorbitant prices for health insurance, or alternatively, whether you have a job that provides it. If you lose your job because you're sick, tough luck. If you miss a payment on your health insurance, oh well. All those years of paying don't count for anything if you stop, because we've decided to rely on a health insurance system rather than a health care system. It's so bad that that's not even really a partisan issue at this point. Sure, a whopping 88% of Democrats support Medicare for all, but nearly 50% of Republicans do too, bringing total American support to nearly 70%. In fact, reducing healthcare costs was the #2 priority among Americans, according to a 2022 poll. And in 2020, every Democratic candidate had to at least pretend to support a substantial reform to the American healthcare system in order to compete with Bernie's compelling message for Medicare for all. Yet despite the intense public interest in healthcare reform, the spotlight the pandemic put on the vulnerabilities in our healthcare system and the fact that 15 million Americans are about to lose their healthcare as the COVID health emergency ends in April, still don't hear much about it. That last bit is probably news to you. Yes, when the Biden administration ends the COVID-19 public health emergency later this year, likely in April or July, Medicaid will be terminating families' health care for the first time since February 2020, according to a report in Newsweek. Why? Well, the Trump administration empowered Health and Human Services to use its emergency powers to support overwhelmed hospitals, make vaccines more accessible, and keep millions of Americans enrolled in public health insurance. Up to 15 million people will be disenrolled from Medicare and CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, when the emergency status ends. Medicaid and CHIP enrollment were up 26% during the pandemic, supporting 89 million people as of last June, according to the government, because Congress blocked states from kicking the needy off their programs as long as the public health emergency persisted. But even if you believe the pandemic is over, what's not over is the public health crisis that predated the pandemic. Are we really just going to go back to letting 68,000 people die every year simply because they're too poor to live? Now, Joe Biden was always the most conservative Democrat in the 2020 pool, but even he had to offer some healthcare solutions. Biden campaigned on a public option, insisting that we needed to build on Obamacare rather than scrapping that deeply flawed half measure and simply moving away from an insurance-based system that confers so much profit on corporate middlemen, the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry. Under a public option plan, Americans could buy a Medicare-like insurance program at a competitive price, basically state-run insurance that's cheaper than private insurance because the government isn't ostensibly seeking to turn a profit. A public option plan was ditched by Obama in 2009-2010 after the health insurance industry lobbied hard to scrap it. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Joe Biden, who took more money from the health insurance industry than any other person in the Democratic primary, seems not to have mentioned the public option since he was sworn into office. It's important to drive home the following point. Politics, the red-blue D versus R of it all, are a distraction from the real battle, which is in fact top-down, corporations versus the people. And the outcome of elections is better predicted by lobbyists than by polls assessing the people's priorities. When an industry can't afford for a candidate to win, they simply pay enough money to make sure the candidate loses. There's no clear illustration of this as we pivot to the 2024 primary season than concerns from private industry about a possible Democratic candidate who might be less eager to appease the big insurance industry than Joe Biden. Let's take a listen.
Will President Biden run or not run? I think we're all waiting to hear his decision. If he decides not to run, we know what we're going to get with the Biden administration, right? We know what we've gotten so far. If he decides not to run and it's opened up and there's a primary, you have Democrats that have a tendency to be a little more liberal, and more left-leaning, and introduce things around Medicare for all, if you remember, with Bernie or with Elizabeth Warren in the past. And so, I think for an investor, it's the headline risk, right? I mean, even if we go back and we look at what happened with the Affordable Care Act, not nearly as bad as people had anticipated. But again, that's once we get to the details, the headlines are generally what caused managed care to trade off. So until we know the public policy of how that individual's thinking, it's hard to make a determination. And as you know, investors sell first and ask questions later.
Do you hear that? Her saying the Affordable Care Act wasn't as bad as they anticipated. That's JP Morgan's head of healthcare services, basically admitting that her organization is rooting against pro-Medicare for all candidates. To be clear, the bank is likely to do more than simply root against a potential Democratic Party challenger to Biden. They'll put their thumb on the scale to the tune of millions of dollars. The insurance industry gave Joe Biden over $8.5 million in 2020, and they gave over $6.5 to Trump, ensuring that whomever won, Americans who want and need health care reform won't get it. JP Morgan donated nearly $400,000 to Biden's campaign, and JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon's wife even contributed $52,800 to those campaign efforts. They're not donating to save democracy. They're donating to ensure that the deeply unequal system they've benefited from doesn't shift at all in your favor, despite the lies politicians in both parties tell you to get you to the polls. Now, what do we do about it? There was once a time when Republicans like John McCain were very serious about campaign finance reform. Unfortunately, those days are largely behind us. Last September, Senate Republicans blocked a bill that required disclosure of dark money donors. And Democrats used Republicans' refusal to reform the system as an excuse not to clean their own house, saying they won't unilaterally disarm. But things might be changing. According to Open Secrets researcher Carl Evers-Hillstrom, 2020 was the first election since Citizens United that liberal, non-party outside groups outspent their conservative counterparts, meaning that dark money can no longer be presumed to advantage Republicans over Democrats. Concerns about the influence of Silicon Valley money in particular, with its left-leaning bias, has also generated some skepticism about dark money among some Republicans. For example, prior to midterm, Pennsylvania senatorial candidate Doug Mastriano, who was overwhelmingly outspent by his Democratic opponent, introduced a resolution to regulate election spending. But without much wider buy-in, the path to a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United is acutely uphill, even though 66% of Republicans support it, according to a 2018 poll by the Center for Public Integrity. An August CBS poll said that 86% of all voters thought the influence of money in politics was a top threat to democracy, higher even than political violence or attempts to overturn elections. Sorry, 1-6 committee. Republican legislators are widely out of step with their voters. But without Democrats leading more vocally on this issue, it's almost certain they'll pay no political penalty for that reality. Representative Jason Crow introduced an End to Dark Money Act on Monday. That's something to watch. And I'm sure Senator Sheldon Whitehouse will continue to reintroduce the Disclose Act, which claims to close loopholes that allow dark money to flood U.S. elections. He introduces it periodically over the last 10 years. Unfortunately, I'm also sure that corrupt politicians will continue to vote it down. The 20 Republican holdouts from last week's Force the Vote moment won the right to keep Kevin McCarthy's super PAC out of Republican primary races, a significant win that progressives who have been targeted by Hakeem Jeffries' super PAC should envy. But this is really one of those issues where as long as voters are willing to vote for politicians because, let's say, they say the right thing about wokeness in one direction or the other, or they signal on some other cultural issue, there won't be any accountability for politicians who still enthusiastically suckle at the teat of dark money and do the substantive bidding of corporations. And I regret to inform you, no matter how strong the polls look in favor of healthcare reform, no matter how many millions of Americans are kicked off of their healthcare as COVID ends, nothing will change unless voters have higher standards for who they'll actually vote for. That's the grim truth. So yeah, I was struck, as I often am, by the unified point of view across partisan camps. Of course, it's more Democrats than Republicans. But the fact that you have these overwhelming majorities, especially in the realm of campaign finance reform, and you don't see much in the way of campaign finance reform, something's got to break. Democrats have got to stop falling in line and voting for Democrats. Republicans have got to stop falling in line and voting for these candidates unless they actually put their money where their mouth is and plan to do something about this really fundamental issue that's keeping the huge gap between what Americans want and what Congress will do so wide.
Yeah, as you said, at the end of your radar, I mean, it's ultimately up to the voters. No amount of cash can make a voter vote for someone else. And if this is what is important to voters, they need to reward candidates that have pledges not to take certain categories of money, because legislatively, this is not going away. I mean, Citizens United is a Supreme Court decision. I think you probably disagree. I think there are sound free speech, First Amendment reasons. That's ultimately what the Supreme Court concluded with the ACLU's agreement, that you do that money is speech, and you have the right to spend money on candidates, and you have the right to organize in a corporation and spend money. That's what the Supreme Court has decided. It would take a constitutional amendment to undo that, or significant changeover at the like a really significant changeover. So that's not going to happen.
I mean, it could. Mind you, most Republicans want that to happen. So that's this weird place that we're in. But I agree that it's unlikely politically.
It depends how you ask these questions, and that's true of the Medicare for All as well. But
it's true of every question in the world.
Well, yeah, but if you say, look, the fundamental issue was, could a documentary filmmaker run a film that was critical of Hillary Clinton in some critical pre-election time period, which is that's what Citizens United is. You're going to have 95% of Republicans, if you explain to them that was the issue at stake, say, no, that was correctly decided. In fact, you're probably going to have a lot of Democrats say that issue was correctly decided.
Right, but of course, that's not really the question that's at issue. When people are asked if they think the influence of dark money in politics is particularly pernicious, it is, what did I say, the number 2 issue among voters in America. So something has to be done. I think there's an awareness of how this is negatively affecting politics. To me, I think the central question is, given people have these diffuse priorities, and given that even though we say something like healthcare, education is ranked higher, often when people go to the polls, they're voting on these other kinds of issues. And I think Republicans in particular are very adept at exploiting certain other more timely, punchy cultural issues to push one way.
Well, often they're voting at the polls. We're often voting for candidates and all their faulty promises and all their,
But those promises have to do with a lot of these kinds of issues. We just saw Ron DeSantis talk about wokeness and military spending. What was it? All of these kinds of things get shoehorned together. All I'm saying is, if we don't really vote clearly, really rank our priorities and clearly make electoral decisions based on what is actually our biggest priority instead of what the punchiest, most angry-making thing on the headlines is, this kind of thing is going to continue, absent some other big, more revolutionary change that affects the system.
All right, we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.